Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Our first speaker is Luke Fischer. Luke Fischer is a philosopher, poet, and author of 6 books, including the monographs Philosophical Fragments as the Poetry of Thinking, Romanticism in the Living Present, and The Poet as Phenomenologist, Rilke and the New Poems, and his third collection of poetry, A Gamble for My Daughter. His co-edited volumes include The Seasons, Philosophical, Literary, and Environmental Perspectives, and Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus, Philosophical and Critical Perspectives. Also a special section of the Goethean Yearbook in 2015 on Goethe and environmentalism. Fischer is also an honorary associate in philosophy at the University of Sydney.
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you everyone for being here. Rudolf Steiner's philosophy of art. In 1888, Steiner gave an important lecture for the Goethe Association in Vienna, which was revised for publication in 1889, entitled Goethe as Father of a New Aesthetics. Building on Goethe and in dialogue with German idealism, this lecture outlines the unique vocation of art, especially how art differs from philosophy or scientific knowledge. Moreover, the lecture anticipates core ideas in the Philosophy of Freedom, published 5 years later, presents the seed of his later anthroposophical approaches to art, and intimates art's significance for higher forms of cognition. In a preface to the 1909 republication of the lecture, Steiner himself states that, quote, "On reading through this lecture, the ideas developed in it appear to me to be a healthy foundation for anthroposophy." I would like to begin with a reconstruction of what at first appears to be the main argument of Goethe as father of a new aesthetics. Steiner makes the claim that the modern discipline of aesthetics, otherwise known as the philosophy of art, made advances in Kant's critique of judgment and then in Schiller's letters on aesthetic education, but took a wrong turn in Schelling and Hegel's thought. Due to the fact that Schelling's views on art changed significantly over the course of his long career, Steiner's criticism is easiest to support in looking at Hegel. According to Hegel, art, along with religion and philosophy, is one of 3 forms of absolute spirit. For our present purposes, we can define absolute spirit as a form in which a culture attains its highest self-comprehension and resolves the apparent oppositions between nature and mind, necessity and freedom, object and subject. Art as a form of absolute spirit coincides with the epoch of ancient Greece, in which art, religion, and nature were inseparable. Greek religion is elaborated in intrinsically artistic form by the poets, sculptors, and architects. In that art is apprehended via the senses, the content of art is sensuously mediated. The second form of absolute spirit, religion, by which Hegel means Christianity, conveys the highest truth in the form of pictorial thinking. The parables of Jesus and the biblical stories are exemplary of this pictorial thinking, which overlaps with poetic imagination. Philosophy, especially Hegel's own system, is the final form of absolute spirit. This has the same content as Christianity, but grasps it in the self-transparent form of conceptual thinking. This is the highest form because in conceptual thinking, the spirit grasps itself as spirit. The 3 forms of absolute spirit thus reflect stages in increasing spiritualization. In art, the absolute is mediated by the senses. In religion, it is mediated by the interior form of imaginative thinking. In philosophy, the absolute is self-consciously grasped in its own spiritual form. Thus, art in Hegel ultimately has the same role as philosophy, to articulate the absolute, but does this in an inferior way to philosophy. In Goethe as father of a new aesthetics, Steiner aims to articulate an alternative vocation for art, which distinguishes it more sharply from the aims of knowledge. He does this by describing how Goethe sees at once a close relationship and important difference between the tasks of science and art. The Goethean scientist rises to a participatory understanding of the ideas, the Urpflanze, Urtier, that come to expression in the diversity of natural forms, but are never exhausted by those forms. While the Goethean scientist spiritually participates in nature's creative process, the artist furthers this very process in the creation of works of art, which make sensibly manifest what otherwise remains invisible in nature. The ideal side of nature that the scientist grasps only mentally is for the artist the starting point of a transformative intervention in the sensible world. Through artistic creativity, sensible appearance is given a higher form than it assumes anywhere in nature alone. Goethe describes the blossom as the most beautiful part of a plant, where the essence of the plant comes to its highest manifestation. The petals are an intensified leaf form. The work of art stands with regard to the whole of nature as a blossom relates to leaves. Art transfigures sensible appearance such that the ideal side of nature becomes phenomenally manifest. The work of art thus appears as a higher work of nature realized through human creativity. As Steiner puts it, the artist is allied with the world's spirit, the creative ground of nature, and furthers the latter's work. Put in evolutionary terms, artistic creativity transforms the realm of sensuous appearance in a way that advances the evolutionary process. It could seem like Goethe and Hegel hold the same view of art, namely that what the scientist or philosopher grasps in a spiritual form, the artist presents through the sensible particular. Yet Steiner draws out a crucial difference between them. The role of art is not the communication of spiritual truth via an inferior sensible form. Rather, it is to raise the realm of sensible appearance into a higher form. Goethe thus describes the work of art as an ideal reality, and Steiner adds that the beautiful is not the, quote, idea in the form of sensible appearance, but rather a sensible appearance in the form of the idea. It is only in the realm of art where the sensible appears to us in a form that satisfies our spirit. We heard about the third realm earlier. This, I think, is evinced in our psychological experience of a genuine work of art. In appreciating a classical Greek sculpture, a building by Gaudi, a Bach cello suite, or a poem by Hölderlin, we feel as though we've finally found ourselves at home in the world. Form, space, sound, word have been transfigured into a sensuous spiritual reality. The ideal of transfiguring the sensuous through art is something that Steiner approached in concrete detail in his theosophical and anthroposophical periods. The difference between a Goethean and a Hegelian aesthetics becomes more complicated when one looks at what Steiner says about this lecture in his autobiography. Steiner makes the claim that despite the great significance of German idealism, the German idealists, Fischer, Schelling, and Hegel, did not manage to rise to a cognition of the spiritual world as such, but could only get as far as an abstract conception of spirit. Art, in contrast, presents a bridge to a real knowledge of the spirit. It turns out that Steiner's early critique of Hegel's aesthetics was also about knowledge. While it is beyond the scope of this paper to assess Steiner's appraisal of German idealism, it is important to consider the epistemic significance he grants to art. Quote, "I desired to see as essential in the work of art that which appears to the senses. But the path which the true artist takes in his creative work appeared to me as a path to the real spirit. He begins with that which is perceptible to the senses, but he transforms this. In this transformation, he is not guided by a merely subjective impulse. Rather, he seeks to give the sensible appearance a form which reveals it as if the spirit itself were present there. The beautiful is not the appearance of the idea in a sensible form, so I said to myself, but rather a presentation of the sensible in the form of the spirit. Thus I saw in the existence of art the entrance of the world of spirit into the sense world, and it is only necessary to metamorphose the powers of the soul, which in the case of the artist work upon matter, to a pure spiritual perception free of the senses in order to penetrate into a knowledge of the spiritual world. End quote. When a poet composes a poem or a sculptor chisels away at the marble, they are informed by a real spiritual impulse. The spirit here is not merely an abstract idea, but a power that works into the sense world. This perspective from Steiner's autobiography opens up a dimension in his 1888 lecture that one might not otherwise notice. In the lecture, Steiner does not state that the spirit is really present in art in a way that contrasts with the abstract notion of spirit in German idealism. However, his characterization of art as being formed in accordance with the idea, rather than as merely representing the idea, can be interpreted as implying the reality of the spirit in art. Art thus provides a bridge between our ordinary modes of cognition and spiritual knowledge. All that is needed, Steiner explains, is to convert artistic creativity into an organ of cognition that is directed towards the invisible. Using Steiner's terminology for higher stages of knowledge, we can say that artistic creativity thereby becomes imagination. And we saw that how that also holds true for the development of abstract art. The significance of the 1888 lecture does not end here. Some of you will have been struck by the resemblance between Steiner's Goethean aesthetics and his later characterization of ethical individualism in the philosophy of freedom, which foregrounds evolutionary theory. In connection with their knowledge of a particular context, the free spirit intuits a moral principle in the self-activity of thinking, envisages an action through moral imagination, and in realizing the action transforms a perceptible context into a more ideal form. Steiner even suggests an analogy between the productive imagination of the artist and the moral imagination of the ethical individual, which in both cases is individually determined, guides the transformation of reality, and provides a middle term between conceptual universality and perceptual particularity. Moreover, Steiner's characterization of the action of the ethical individual as an advancement of the Steiner characterizes this as an advancement of the evolutionary process. Quote, ethical individualism is spiritualized evolutionary theory. Evolutionists must regard the morally free life as a spiritual continuation of organic life, end quote. This continuity is illustrated in the direct parallels Steiner draws between the evolution of species and the history of ethics. Anticipating Bergson's notion of creative evolution, Steiner explains that while a later species evolves out of an earlier one, we could never predict the later species merely on the basis of an earlier one. Similarly, the ethical individual realizes a moral intuition that shows a connection to previous norms, but is not derivable from them. We can see, for example, a connection between the ideal of enfranchisement championed by the first advocates of women's suffrage and the earlier abolition of slavery. But the earlier ideal does not necessitate the later. The history of ethical norms is, so to speak, the paleontological record of individually realized moral intuitions. While every person is enculturated in the norms of a society, the free spirit transcends any sense of coercion from existing norms in acting out of a transparent grasp of the spiritual source of morality. In short, the philosophy of art outlined in the 1888 lecture belongs together with the conception of ethical individualism in the philosophy of freedom. Moreover, ideas that Steiner first worked out in his Goethean conception of art played a crucial role in the emergence of the philosophy of freedom. While this can be ascertained simply through a chronology of Steiner's intellectual development as recorded in his publications, Steiner says as much in his autobiography. Quote, "At that time, true knowledge, the manifestation of the spiritual in art, and the ethical will in the human being membered themselves into a whole for me. I could not but recognize in the human personality a central point at which these are connected in the most immediate unity with the primal being of the world. It is from this central point that the will takes rise. If the clear light of the spirit is effective in this central point, then the will is free. The human being is then acting in harmony with the spiritual nature of the world, which creates not by reason of necessity, but rather in the realization of its own being. Through the experience of true beauty, I desired to see the spirit which works in the human being when he labors in the sensible in such a way that his spiritual being flows forth into the world, which is indeed of the spirit, but does not directly reveal it. Through a perception of the true, I desired to experience the spirit which reveals itself in its own being. A philosophy of freedom hovered before my soul." In that Steiner first conceived a philosophy of freedom in connection with his lecture on Goethe's aesthetics, it is somewhat surprising that the philosophy of freedom contains no section devoted to art. Perhaps structural arguments can be made in support of this exclusion. Steiner's central aim was to articulate the possibility and reality of human freedom, so he primarily needed to demonstrate the relationship between thinking and the will. Nevertheless, had the content of the 1888 lecture been reiterated in the context of the philosophy of freedom, the twofoldness of thinking and willing would have been elaborated in its threefold harmony of the true, the beautiful, and the good, knowledge, art, action, epistemology, aesthetics, ethics, and insofar as art addresses our feeling life in a crucial way, thinking, feeling, and willing. Moreover, in the intuition at the time of the Goethe lecture in which Steiner first conceived his philosophy of freedom, these three spheres were revealed as members of a whole. For Steiner, knowing, art, and ethical action all transform reality, but each in its specific way. In knowing, what is given to my observation is complemented with the relevant concepts that I generate through the activity of thinking. The phenomena are thus raised into the sphere of spiritual universality. Through the creative individuality of the artist, the sensible realm is transformed into a higher form such that the particular work of art manifests the spirit to an extent that is not the case for any particular phenomenon of nature. Art could thus be described as knowing that has become a power to transform the sensible. In ethical action, as in art, the individual creatively intervenes in perceptual reality and raises it into a more ideal form in accordance with a moral intuition. We might call ethical action art applied to the practical conditions of life, and call art ethical action that is realized as a singular aesthetic phenomenon. This brings us to two crucial figures in thinking about the relationship between art and morality, one who inspired Steiner and one who was in turn inspired by Steiner. The first, Schiller, in his Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Humankind, articulated a close tie between freedom and artistic beauty, as well as their significance in forming the citizens of a republic. Schiller even went as far as to suggest that society is a collaborative work of art on a grand scale. Quote, "The most perfect of all works of art, the building up of true political freedom," end quote. Here, Schiller both anticipated and influenced the artist Joseph Beuys, who thought that the powers at work in artistic creation needed to be extended to the practical conditions of life. We all, according to Beuys, have the capacity to become social artists or social sculptors, and the development of this capacity is necessary to addressing the crises, including the ecological crisis of contemporary society. While Beuys's terminology is less precise than Steiner's, in that he does not clearly delineate between the realm of art and the practical realm of ethics, his expanded notion of art is true to Steiner's vision of the close association of knowing, art, and ethical action in the free individual. Moreover, Steiner himself also sometimes used the notion of art in an extended sense, as in speaking of the art of education. As important as it is to keep in view the threefoldness of the true, the beautiful, and the good, in light of his creative contributions to many practical realms of life, it might nonetheless be apt to characterize Steiner himself as a social artist.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.